thank you everyone for joining us to this webinar. It is organized, as you can see already, by three entities, by the School of Education here at IU in Bloomington, and by the ASEAN and Euro IU Global Gateways. And so today we are honored and grateful to have with us, joining us, Professor Anke Grotlüschen from Hamburg University. We are also joined by Professor Amy Pickert from Indiana University. Professor Grotlüschen is a professor of lifelong learning at the University of Hamburg. She has been responsible for Germany's nationwide Level 1 survey since 2010, launched by the education minister, the former president of the German Bundestag, and the president of educational ministers of the Länder. Dr. Grotlüschen's advice for policymakers at all levels has strongly influenced the German national strategy for adult literacy and basic education. Dr. Amy Pickert is assistant professor in adult education in the Department of Learning, Design, and Adult Education. I'm Faridah Pawan, professor of education. I lead the Global and International Engagement Office here at School of Education, as well as I'm the IU ASEAN Global Gateway Academic Director.
Yes, and my name is Annabel Türk. I'm the Assistant Director of the Indiana University Europe Gateway, and at the Gateways we facilitate a range of activities for different IU stakeholders and connect them to partners in the region. And one of these connections is the great connection and long-standing partnership between University of Hamburg and Indiana University, particularly between the School of Education and the Faculty of Education. And I think this webinar is a great addition to the ongoing institutional partnership activities between the two schools. So I'm excited to listen to this today.
Thank you, Annabelle. The webinar will take the form of a 30-minute conversation between Professor Grotlüschen and Dr. Pickert and myself. Professor Grotlüschen and Professor Pickert, if we could use first names from this point onwards, that would be helpful for us. We will then proceed with a 20-minute Q&A from the audience. In the meantime, audience members, you can post questions anytime on the Q&A box there on your screen. And at the end of 30 minutes, we'll pull the questions out and direct them to our speakers. Professor Grotlüschen, welcome to the conversation and welcome to our community. Professor Grotlüschen, any first words you want to share with us?
Thank you so much. Yeah, great to be here. Thanks for the invite, and thanks for the kind words you had for me. Actually, yes, I do like to have a kind of a bit of the background about how I feel connected with you, Faridah, but also with Amy Pickert, because that has something to do with what we read or what you read and why that was published. Because Alisa Belzer and Amy Pickert were kind of the starting point of what happened later with their paper, The Imagined Learner. That was a meta-study on qualitative research published in the Adult Education Quarterly, a high-ranked journal that we usually don't get into as Germans, or I don't know. We haven't been at that in that position at those times. That was published in 2015 or something like that, pretty early. And pretty impressive. It had quite an impact in the German landscape of adult literacy educators, both practitioners as well as policymakers. So that's why I felt, okay, I have to read this and I have to kind of figure out how this research is done. And the best way to do that was to invite Alisa Belzer over to Hamburg in 2018. And the end of that invite and that cooperation was this article that you put on the reading list on the Imagined Learner and Adult Education Policy, because I do more policy research than learner research. That was kind of a direct effect of Amy's and Alisa's earlier work, actually. And we did the second level 1 survey in the meantime that was had an impact on what we call today a literacy decade, a literacy strategy. So the literacy strategy that we have in Germany has a lot to do with the strategies that we researched, or that mostly Alisa researched for the second paper. And then we stayed in contact through COVID, so everyone was in their own office and trying to cope with the COVID dangers. But we had the chance to cooperate again with the how do we call that, adult learning and education within the framework of lifelong learning. That's the paper that took 8 countries into consideration. So we had digital interviews, digital group interviews with people from like Jordan, Thailand, Australia, Brazil, Ukraine, Kyrgyzstan, etc. For some of the countries, I had to look up on the map where they are. So South Africa also was on the screen, and that led to what we maybe discussed today. It has a strong connection with the Marrakesh Framework for Action 22 and the UNESCO Grail Global Report on Adult Learning and Education. So that's kind of a way we went through since 2015 until we're here. And there's more than one cooperative publication. And what I find interesting, Faridah, you have sent me some questions, and I never discussed them together. And we never thought of how they interlink with each other. And there may be some contradictions, and I find it interesting to discuss.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. So this is what this webinar will be about, is a back and forth and format and quick back and forth. And so that's what we're doing. So if I may, because I see a lot of speakers here, including your co-author, the main author of that piece, Alyssa, is here. So Professor Belza, welcome. And so one of the things that we want to start off with, because we have a group of people here who are new to the field, who are already immersed in the field, or who are interested in continuing in the field. So the first question is, given the writings that you have, what is the difference between adult education and lifelong learning? I mean, where is the distinction, or where are the points of juxtaposition?
Yeah, you want a short answer or you want the discourse?
Somewhere brief.
In between, yeah. Actually, when you ask me about lifelong learning, I would always say it starts with 16 plus, age 16 plus, when people like leave the formal educational system, and then it's interesting for us. But that's for many others more or less the definition of adult education and learning. So formal school is more or less over. They may stay quite a while in university or high school education, but somehow adults, in some countries in the world, people are considered adults from the age 16. And when we differentiate adult education and learning, we would say there's a part of informal learning, like looking up things on YouTube. There's a part of non-formal learning, that the majority of activities like workshops, seminars, webinars like we're doing here, etc., mostly run by community education centers or run by companies or training institutions, language training institutions, etc. And the formal part of adult education and learning in Germany has a lot to do with upward mobility in the vocational education system. That's very different by country. Many other countries would say second chance schooling also belongs to formal adult education. That depends on country. But the key within the adult learning and education part is it is adults. However you define adults. In some countries you are an adult up from 10 years on. In some countries you are an adult from 16. In some countries it takes until 27 until you're considered adult. So being someone who has their own responsibilities or being economically independent from your family, etc. In the lifelong learning definition and discussion for ages, lifelong learning was somehow considered to be something for adults. That was from the FOR report, in many ways. When I asked my university students here what they think about lifelong learning, what that may be, they start telling me a lot of things, but the key component in all of these things is they are talking about adults. It's self-evident for them that lifelong is, well, the longest part of your life is adult life. Actually, in the Sustainable Development Goal discussion, this is kind of understood differently. Then lifelong is understood as starting with early childhood education, going through primary, secondary education, tertiary education, all the formal system. this would be fine, but the SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, are an important policy paper and have an impact on policy making and funding. And when when institutions report or ministries report to the UNESCO whether or not they make progress in the SDG 4 on lifelong learning, they say, oh yes, we invested a lot of money into early childhood education. So we met our lifelong learning goals. We are doing well. And people like us, say, who are in charge of adult education and learning, say, hey, wait, you took that money perhaps from the adult education funds. That's why it is so much, there's so much tension in it, such a discussion on different policy levels. Yeah, maybe this is enough for the moment. Understanding why the terminology matters.
Right. Terminology does matter because it is a point of confusion. And Amy, please chime in at any point in time, this point in time. And I think one of the things, because the Marrakesh Framework for Action, or MFA, the Grill report that came out of that, and the SDG, I mean, I think all these things with, is focusing on lifelong learning. And to some extent, that's when we all look at it, we're saying, okay, ALE, or adult learning, is pushed in the background. So again, it's becoming more and more of a stepchild. And so is this a concern? I'm sure, I mean, you just said it was a concern, but what's being done to bring it forth to the surface?
Actually, what you're mentioning, and I'm happy to hear Amy's and Alyssa's opinion about it, and the opinion of students as well. What you're mentioning is the different levels of UNESCO and UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning. So the SDG is not even UNESCO, it's UN, so that's the highest level of United Nations. That's okay. The UNESCO, with their home base in Paris, is what Katarina Popovic says, they have their Paris agenda. And the Paris agenda is to put education first, and they mean school education or early childhood. That's what some scholars say, and they have a good overview. Like Katarina Popovic is very close to all these UNESCO discussions. The UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning in Hamburg, the lifelong learning, formerly UNESCO Institute for Education, but now lifelong learning, they tend to understand lifelong learning a bit more like adult educational learning, and they advocate for adults. At least now they have a new director, and they monitor the GRAIL. They are responsible for the GRAIL. That's why the GRAIL is so much on adult learning. The Global Report on Adult Learning and Education, that's what it reports. And they are also responsible for having the Confintea conferences every 12 years. It's a worldwide conference, UNESCO level 2 conference. Level 1 is ministers, is prime ministers. Level 2 is the ministries. And this happens every 12 years. And they, the key resolution of the 2022 conference is the Marrakesh Framework for Action. So the UIL, the smallest institute of all of them, is strongly advocating for adult learning and education as the key component of lifelong learning. They are branding it this way. So Hamburg is advocating for adults. They do it in the Marrakesh Framework for Action. They do it in the GRAIL. Paris is advocating for education. Maybe school education, early childhood. They have it under education. And UN is advocating for the SDGs, and that's 17 SDGs, one out of them being education. And 4.4 is lifelong learning, 4.1 is school, 4.2 is vocational education and training, and 4.7 is citizenship education. And there's only 4.1 to 4.7. So it's at the very end of the ladder. The priority.
Could I ask a question? Anke, I was really pleased to have the opportunity to read the paper that you all did, looking about the relationship between SDG 4 and adult education policy making. And I wondered if you could share an example of a time, I mean, from my perspective, it seems that some countries feel more beholden to UNESCO's goals and other countries feel less so. And I wondered if you could share an example of when the SDG 4 had influenced a country's adult education policy making, and maybe any insights into your thoughts about which countries are more likely to adhere and which countries are less, and why.
Yeah, so it's so funny you asked that. Actually, I saw that Alyssa has a comment in the Q&A, so if someone would come back to that. Yeah, that was the contradiction in what we found. We have a strong discourse going, showing these negotiations between the Paris agenda and the Hamburg agenda, or the adult learning and education as key component. And when it comes to the qualitative findings from 8 countries in 22, we see that adult learning and education has always been the stepchild in funding. It's always been the afterthought, and there is a hierarchy between professional and continuing education, which receives more funding and more stable funding and micro-credentials, etc., and citizenship education. The less formal things get, the more precarious they are in funding. The more formal, also in adult education, the more formal things get, the more stable the funding is. But this currently, in 22, was disconnected in terms of money or funding shift, because there was no funding shift. Like, I remember the Indian interview who said there was never any money. There is no money in the educational system at all. They never shifted money from adult education to early childhood. There was no money to shift. There is a difference. There are many other things going on. There's a rise of populism, populist governments, especially in India, or in this Indian example. They do shift money elsewhere. But as far as I understand the data we got, most of the findings was SDGs could become a threat, but currently the problem is there without the SDGs. The problem of having a completely underfunded adult education sector that there was even before the SDGs came into practice.
SDG, for those of us, you want to explain what SDG means?
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, that was one of my questions to your audience, whether or not you are familiar with the Sustainable Development Goals or not, because it's a UNESCO thing, and the USA is so large, so we have the tendency that smaller countries rely more on supranational policies and larger countries don't. That's why I would find it interesting to know whether it's a discourse in the USA or not. The Sustainable Development Goals were launched by the United Nations in 2015. It's 17 goals. The first is, I think, eradicate poverty and make sure that water is available for everyone in the world, and eradicate hunger. And many of the Sustainable Development Goals focus ecological sustainability. That's one of the core issues in it. The philosophical change in SDGs compared to the earlier Millennium Development Goals was that each and every country is understood as having to develop. There's not the industrialized countries on the one hand and the developing countries on the other hand anymore. But since 2015, the UNESCO understands the whole globe as needing to develop. All countries are developing. So we all try to contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals. And they are mostly on treating the world and the planet as sustainable, so not over-exploiting the planet, and also teaching people how to handle or how to organize their lives in a climate-friendly or climate-neutral way. That's why SDG 4, the educational aim, is quite relevant in the Sustainable Development Goals.
Yeah,
Sustainable means not to overexploit your resources.
Thank you. I think you and Professor Belzer were quite critical of the SDG goals and how it was and its alignment or manifestation in terms of adult learning. And so I think one of the comments from Alyssa, if I may use your first name, is even when adults are included in lifelong learning, it often prioritizes vocational and formal education and rarely all other learning goals and interests that adults have. And so, so in essence, is this also reflected on in terms of the SDG goals, whereby adults are seen more as a tool for sustainability achievement, or what are your thoughts on that?
That depends on who you ask. When you check for the Marrakesh Framework for Action that has been made by educational ministries who send their staff who is in charge of adult education. One of the first sentences of the Marrakesh Framework for Action is that adult learning and education contributes to all 17 SDGs. So it contributes to overcoming hunger, contributes to sustainable use of water supply, etc., and to peaceful societies and democratic societies. When it comes to SDG 4 only, the terminology in SDG 4 is ensure inclusive and equitable quality education and promote lifelong learning opportunities for all. So inclusive education is relevant for around the world. I think that's cool. Equitable quality education means there are also issues in quality when it comes to teaching and learning, whether it is early childhood or adult learning. And lifelong learning opportunities for all says there's an opportunity, but it doesn't mean there's a provision for everyone. You know, primary education should be provided to everyone. Lifelong learning should be open to everyone. That's the difference. In many countries, less than 30% of the population participate in lifelong learning. And when you look at 4.1, 4.2, 4.3, 5, etc., there is not a single subpoint saying adult education and learning is a goal in itself. It is 4.1, as I said, 4.1 is girls and boys get free, equitable primary education and secondary education. 4.2 is childhood development. 4.3 is equal access for women and men to affordable and quality technical, vocational, and tertiary education. So that's that. And I would say there is a hierarchy in it. As Alyssa Belzer said in her comment, there is a hierarchy that when it comes to adults, when it finally comes to adults, then vocational education and professional education is ranked higher than citizenship education, democratic education, language education for incoming refugees or migrants, etc. And only in 4.6 there's the aim that a substantial proportion of adults, both men and women, should achieve literacy and numeracy, which are definitely very basic skills. And 4.7 has everything else, like promote sustainable development, including human rights, gender equality, promotion of a culture of peace and non-violence, global citizenship, and cultural diversity as a contribution to sustainable development. So it feels like 4.7 was where everything was put. That wasn't rewarding enough for the ministries to put it higher, because it doesn't play out, it doesn't follow the human capital approach. It follows the humanistic and democratic approach. That was 22. I don't know whether it would happen the same in 24 or 5 or 6, because we have currently so many problems in so many democracies around the world that this may have changed if the the Konfentea would have taken place later. Yeah.
So are you saying that, I mean, this is what you just said is very important because you mentioned two things, the humanistic approach in adult education, as well as the human capital approach. And, you know, I think that is really bringing up something, reflecting something about the status of adult education in terms of, you know, the approaches that's taken, but it also reflects in terms of the categories of the imagined learners of adult education that Professor Belzer and you wrote about, which, if I may read, you know, very interesting categories: adult learners as a problem, a pawn, an afterthought, a competitor, competent citizen. I mean, again, the humanistic approach and the human capital approach are reflected in those underlie those categories. Do you see that? Could you kind of clarify that those two, the humanistic and human capital approach, and those, and how they are reflected in the categories, if they do?
In a way, yes. But actually, I really appreciate that Amy is here and that Alyssa is here, because these definitions of categories wasn't my work. There was their work in the earlier articles as well as the latter one. And two of the categories, I would also agree that yes, when it comes to the competent citizen, then it is more a humanistic approach, and you find it in some of the literacy strategies. The competent citizen is an imagination of a learner who wants to contribute to a whatever peaceful society, and maybe even a democratic society. In some countries, this is we find that in their literacy strategies. And also, when it comes to the competitor, I find this, and this is what we wrote, and probably Alyssa found, is that there is a connection with neoliberalism and a human capital approach, so more the OECD side of the supranational organizations. But I found it so interesting to see there's more than these two, because we so often split the debate between, you know, UNESCO humanistic approach, OECD human capital approach, and then that's it. So we have the good, the bad, and the ugly. But it is so interesting to find I mean, these are 22 strategies around the world, 22 literacy strategies around the world, and I like the pawn approach, saying that literacy is moved around according to the current policies. You know, it is used for the current policymakers or the current government to support their strategy. So, like you find that in early Turkey in the 1920s, when Turkey left the Ottoman Reich, the Arabic Reich changed their literacy, their language, their written system from Arabic letters to Latin letters, and with it, this launched a huge Kemalistic literacy campaign, also addressing women, addressing workers, in order to implement their new policy, their new, in a way, socialist but not dictatorship-like socialist policies. To have a strong workers' movement, to have a stronger gender equity, a secular society where the Muslim regime doesn't have so much impact anymore. And this was, you know, founded with the literacy strategy, the whole policy approach. And we see that in Nicaragua, for example, in 1979, when the revolution took over. They were so quick. In 79 in summer, the revolution took over. And in 79 in autumn, they had their literacy campaign up and rolling, in order to implement this new government. And this is Nicaragua, and at that early time, and Cuba and the Arab Spring are not part of the sample that we currently saw. But in weaker forms, in a weaker version, you find that in quite many of the strategies that they are used to implement the current, you know, I wouldn't say ideology, but the current paradigm of the ongoing government. And that's something that is, we see that in many countries, but it's difficult to, to nail it down. And that's what, why I find the pawn as the category so interesting.
That's fascinating. And it also brings up the idea that with that comes if you're thinking about the question of who is literate and who is not literate, changes like that come with reclassification of a whole new swath of people as not literate, right? Like you're imposing this new regime, and to be literate in that regime means to be able to use this set of practices.
Yeah.
So even the category of like what is a literate adult is completely fluid.
Reorganized, yeah. And in many ways, what we find about the afterthought is not surprising. And adult education being the afterthought in many strategies, and the learner by itself being put behind all the other educational strategies. That's pretty similar to the stepchild we found in later research.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, we're getting to the 30-minute point, and I want to invite the audience to post your questions, to share your thoughts in the Q&A. We'll draw them into the conversation as we proceed. So at this point in time, we invite you all to chime in, in any form, in any way you want through the Q&A. And so, I think this is, going again into the conversation that we're talking now about the categories of adult learners that, Professor Grotlüschen and Professor Belzer in their piece wrote, as well as Professor Pickard, all of these, we have authors here, essentially, in our webinar today. We're very fortunate to say that, to have them all. One of the things that I think one of the categories also speak of the citizenship focus, because one of the categories is the competent citizen, adult learners as the competent citizen. And so again, for me, my field is, besides being in the field of instructional system technology, I'm also a second language, foreign language person. And I see a few people online here who are as well. And so I think for us, when we're talking about competent citizens, S is in the SDG, S in the Marrakesh framework, S in the GRAIL 5. GRAIL 5 is the UNESCO's 5th latest report on the state of adult education. When we talk about citizenship, and global citizenship is one of the focus of the report for adult learners. I mean, to me, it raises some level of worry, given the field that I'm from. Is this a question of, the underlying here is the integration of citizenship. And so, so several things come to mind. Are we talking about assimilation? Are we talking about competency to participate politically, socially, or what are we talking about in terms of the emphasis of this category and this focus of the GRAIL 5, which is the report on adult education, the latest international report?
I just recently had lunch with one of the organizers of the GRAIL 5. Her name is Rakat. She's from Kyrgyzstan, lives in Canada, and works in Hamburg. That's the typical UNESCO staff way of living. And it was her who tried to convince the former director, David Arena, to put citizenship into the core of the 5th GRAIL. All the GRAILs have one extra theme, one extra item. One of them, the GRAIL 3 was on literacy, GRAIL 4, I don't know what. So this one time, GRAIL 5 was on citizenship. And she said it was so hard to negotiate that to him, because she knew it would give him a hard time to negotiate that to, like, the Emirates or India or Brazil or whatever country that currently is not so much after competent citizenship in their population. And they made it. they put citizenship into the center of the Grail, and I don't know whether you know how the Grail works. UNESCO sends it out to all their members, that's 195 states, member states, and the members tick the questionnaire, and they have to tick boxes. They have to tick whether or not they have any provision on citizenship, whether they have any funding for citizenship education, whether they have any interest in adult citizenship education, whether, etc. So it's kind of an agenda setting effect. They don't raise funding that way, but they put it into the awareness of the ministries and those who are the stakeholders in the ministries, the stakeholders for adult learning and education. And in most of the countries, you have at least one person who is responsible for adult education and learning. So they have a reason to kind of say, okay, UNESCO is coming up with citizenship education, and we can negotiate that to our ministries and government. That's the effect of why they're doing that. And actually, frankly speaking, whether they understand it as a humanistic approach or whether they use it as a token or a pawn for their next government strategy, or whether they understand citizenship education as allowing females to drive a car, that's not the issue in that questionnaire. The question how you define it, whether they define it in a sophisticated way, whether they take up scholarly discussions, that's not the problem in the Grail. The Grail is just making people think of something and report back and make them, visibly compete in a ranking where you can show, okay, you are at whatever, step 2 in cool citizenship education, and other countries are like, maybe countries that are also low-income countries or middle-income countries perform better. But you do know. That's the game. That's the way how the Grail works. The Grail is has been launched before the conference here in Marrakesh. So they get the data, meet, and have to agree on a resolution. And the resolution said lifelong learning is key. Adult education is key for lifelong learning. And they have 3 sections, that is professional education, literacy education, and citizenship education. And citizenship education in the Marrakesh Framework for Action is the first one. It's a policy-making process. That's not a scholarly discussion.
It's fascinating, though, too. So if I'm understanding what you're saying, that UNESCO establishing these categories as sort of a supranational body then provokes these responses within countries. So if UNESCO says citizenship is a component of adult education, then countries start doing citizenship education regardless of how they're defining it.
They have to report on whether or not they have anything in citizenship education. And it makes it more visible and more relevant.
Got you. Could you also, you have said several times throughout the discussion, you've used the phrase a humanistic approach to adult education. And I wonder if you could just define your thinking around that. What are you thinking when you say that?
Yeah, interesting. There's such a discussion on whether or not this is a northern and probably European terminology, going back to enlightenment and having quite negative impact, post-colonial impact onto countries that have different values. However, the humanistic approach in lifelong learning kind of started with the Fore report in '72, saying that you want to have you want education as something that supports your full flowering up the best way you can as a personality. I don't know the
self-actualization, I think, is the term that we often use in the States. Does that capture what you mean?
It sounds good. It is deeply rooted in Humboldt's educational theory and Kant's theory on understanding or using your brains on your own and not being dependent on churches or kings to tell you what to do. That's the Enlightenment background of it, but you also know that it is an approach that has a strong emphasis on rationality, on rational arguments, and has a kind of difficulties with emotions, difficulties with everything that goes beyond universities or academic approaches, academic discussions. And in this way, you probably know that Kant and in a way also Humboldt have been deeply racist, and also starting or being the ones that allowed Europe to go abroad and try to conquer the world and sell slaves. Sorry for the wording. So,
yeah. Would you differentiate a humanistic approach from a human rights approach?
Yes, human rights is a policy paper. Human rights is a policy agreement by again I think UN, but signed by a couple of countries, but not all of the countries. And in many countries in the world, human rights is not the core value. Human rights, for example, one of the human rights is that women are treated equally to men, which is not the case in none of the countries, but in some countries it's better than in other countries. Okay. If I look to Iran, for example, and say, hey, you don't treat your females fair enough, then I'm using Northern values and tell them what to do and how to organize their lives. Iran is maybe not such a good example, but there are many countries in the world that do not stick to the Northern human rights approach, but also live peaceful lives and have their own sustainability. In many ways, perhaps treat the planet better than we do. So the human rights agreement is fantastic in many ways, but it's still applied as a governance approach, saying that the North is better or more developed than everyone else. That's what makes it difficult, and it's a dilemma. You can never get out of it as long as you feel that men, women, and whatnot need to be treated equally. Then the human rights approach is something you do not discuss and say, this is it, I stand on these shoulders and I won't negotiate it. That's my position. But still, with this position, we tend to underestimate how other approaches may work out in sustainability or peaceful cooperation and coexistence.
Mm-hmm. We have a question from Karen. I'm going to go to her because she's posted this question a few minutes ago. And I think it continues the discussion about the difference between the humanistic approach and the human capital approach. And I think distinguishing it from human rights is very helpful also at this point in time. So Karen asked, can you speak about how companies or organizations that are interested in supporting their human capital are able to address the needs of their employees as lifelong learners? And so you have, examples from your writings of 8 countries that you looked at. And so what are some of your thoughts about this, about Karen's question?
Okay, technically, the human capital approach is an economic approach. And that says when a company uses their capital, then it's about money, it's about factories or buildings, whatever, and it's about land. That's the 3 types of resources from Marx's economic theory. And the 4th pillar is human capital. So from an economic approach, it is so interesting to shift the investment, the discussion on where we invest money in a company from factories to humans. So when you discuss with people from economic sciences, they say, hey, wait, the human capital approach is the best thing we have since in the 1960s. From an educational perspective, we treat people as capital by applying the human capital approach, and that doesn't work with the educational ethos of treating people as people. And this gives a certain overlap, when, for example, when people are pursuing a career, someone wants to upskill and become a leader or a female leader in a company or a diverse leader in a company and promote company diversity and profits. there may be an overlap between the individual interest and the interest of the company. And in this area, it's of course a cool way to just support people to pursue their individual, maybe female or diverse career, and contribute to the company profit and benefit. And in many ways, it's this is done by companies and in companies, and sometimes paid by the employees, those who want to pursue their career. There's also kind of an publicly funded vocational education or technical education and skills branch, and that's usually set up to avoid inequalities in these vocational and technical adult education and learning, because those who are, the fittest, the strongest, those who earn most, they will invest into their career by themselves. But the others can't, and that's why it's necessary to have public funding there. Now, that happens, for example, in Jordan. We saw a lot of activity in Kyrgyzstan. Ukraine also have that. South Africa said we invest a lot in what they call TVET, technical and vocational education training, but there's no jobs anyway. So why invest in TVET? Why invest so much in skills when they really have job shortages after COVID? That answering your question, it wasn't so detailed on what countries do. Yeah. I would like.
I think the article, the report that you and your co-authors put together is quite illustrative. I think it goes back to Karen's question and to Arnell's question, which is the regions of the world that have the most progressive adult education policies. Now, one of the things, if you could, the examples, quick examples from each of the countries that you looked at. For instance, Thailand has a 100-year history of adult education, and they've, gone into spiritual education, all those, it's incredible to read, actually. And I wish one of our colleagues here, Sumunit, who's heading that in Thailand, was here, and she knows about this conference. But, examples, like specific examples like that you could bring forth so that we see a little bit of what the world is doing based on the report that you've written up so well.
I find it so interesting to see that Thailand, also India, Asia has such an acknowledgement for people who are kind of aging, and by aging they may need or may benefit from further education and training, and they also have something to give back. That's in the Thailand example. It's not only about providing services to people who are aged or etc., but they also ask them to give their knowledge, their wisdom back to their communities, and that's fascinating. I saw in some of the countries, I'm not sure about Brazil, but the Aryan example may also be relevant here. I saw in some of the countries that before they were colonized, they had a strategy, or they had an idea of lifelong learning that, for example, in India, comes from very early spiritual or religious approaches, saying that you develop all your life, you become better all your life, etc. And that was a notion of lifelong learning with a strong understanding of humanism, personality development, as well as or something like a focus on the later life, or a focus on your life and not only formal education, because at that time it was not necessarily clear that everyone received formal education or primary education. And they said in some of the Indian publications that this was destroyed when the British came. So adult learning was then reduced to human capital approaches, and it was reduced with the UNESCO approaches and turned to the neoliberal paradigm. So you need to upskill all your life, all the time, in order to be fit enough for the market and not cost anyone any money. So there was a pre-colonial lifelong learning idea, spirit, that was very interesting. from what happened in some countries, I always like to talk about the South African example when the COVID lockdowns came to the townships, to where everyone got unemployed immediately with the lockdown. They realized that they get into food insecurity and fundamental different difficulties, and they started soup kitchens, but they also started urban gardening in order to, well, sustainably produce their own groceries. And this went on. Currently, they have more than 300 networks that continue producing things. I found that thrilling. There's a lot of research about it. And in Ukraine, when we had these interviews in September, August, September 22, that was pretty shortly after the Russians invaded the Ukraine, or parts of the Ukraine. They used their infrastructure to immediately provide first aid training or mental health training or training on how to talk with children about the war, how to spend the night in a bomb shelter, etc. So they used the infrastructure, the networks, and their training skills and their creativity and the mailing lists to provide people with what was needed at that very moment. And I found that fascinating because adult education and learning can react so quickly to catastrophes and mega level crisis that we saw in so many ways.
This is interesting because there's a lot of comments here about what's in the adult language, adults learning in the West and adult learning elsewhere. I think there's also a pushback to the discussion. I think Alyssa, Professor Belzer, is taking back to us to the discussion of differentiating human capital, humanistic, and human rights approaches because they point to very distinct ideas as to who gets support for ALE and adult learning and in what ways. And so I think as we're running out of time, we have only a few minutes, I'm going to raise this as well as the idea of, what the West focuses on and what other parts of the world focuses on in terms of adult language, in terms of ALE. I think for me, the elephant in the room with ALE and its juxtaposition with lifelong learning is the perception of who adult learners are, because we're looking at, are they ones who can afford to continue their education because that's a different category of people, and the vulnerable position and the vulnerable individuals who really need support, lifelong support, in order to survive. I think that's the distinction that's being blurred when lifelong learning, for me, is talked about rather than adult education per se. So that's one point. You can address any or all or neither. But in terms of the comments here with the discussion of spiritual focus and all what's happening around the world, the differences between, the foci, for instance, in South Africa, the focus on community types of learning. So if you want to speak in terms of both or one or the other, please do so. If you want to take it on to the next line of discussion, please continue as well, because this is raising many things that I think we're running out of time to talk about. So your choice, Elisa. Sorry, Elisa. Sorry, Anke.
I think Elisa would love to answer about that. Because she did Brazil and Jordan, and these countries are so different from what I did. Oh, there she is.
So Elisa, yes, if you want to join us.
Thank you. Go ahead, Anka.
There's one question. I'm wondering what regions of the world have the most progressive adult ed policies, and that's not the approach we used for this research. We didn't compare countries with each other. When I would have to answer that question, I would rely on what UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning says, and they would say South Korea has an impressive lifelong learning strategy because they see they have an aging population and they are kind of scared of losing ground. They really quickly invested. And OECD usually points to Singapore, but I find that unfair because Singapore is so small and so rich. And it's so easy to invest in adult education when you have so much money. So it has a lot to do with money. But Alyssa, please feel free to to add.
Sorry, I have to confess, I was responding to a question here where I'm sitting, so I didn't hear the question.
So I go back to the
Sorry.
question, what regions of the world have the most progressive adult education policies?
Okay.
And what distinctions do you see between the West, the North, the South in terms of our approaches, if you want to go that direction?
Well, I think the question of what's most progressive is interesting because what is progressive in this particular case? So going back to the distinction between humanistic and human capital, I would think that humanistic, if you want to use that very broad brush, is going to be a more progressive approach. But we saw if there was at any time a more humanistic approach, it's the first to be cut in every country when budgets go down. So I would say, that the idea of, informal learning, lifelong learning that is about adults' needs for learning and not a government's or a ministry's needs for adults to learn is more an ideal than a reality in most places. Just because it's always the first to go or doesn't fit with the goals of the policy or whatever. So, going back to Thailand, for example, in some ways you could say, well, that is very much, a more humanistic approach to adult education. But if you want to speak more specifically about adult literacy education, that idea of what is literacy education for is just, like I said, more an ideal than a reality when you think about a more progressive approach. I think there have been moments in time in the US, in the UK, in Australia, and those are, the examples I know of best, where there was this very big emphasis on a learner-centered approach, which I guess you could equate with humanism, where the idea was education is for the adult to determine what they need. But that is long gone in those countries. I don't know about in other countries.
Just to have some hope in the end of the discussion, we see that a lot of funding cuts. When it comes to really difficult situations, adult education often steps in. Like we had countries where they reported about landslides, about bushfires, droughts, whatever happened under the climate change, climate injustice. Most of the Global South publishers or authors call it global climate injustice and not climate change. And we see that many adult education organizers, community organizers connect with each other. Like, for example, in Australia, there was a so-called man shed movement. People, men, often elderly men, would drive their wives to do gymnastics and spend their time waiting in the parking lot. And they now started to hang out in sheds where small workshops. And these workshops were the places where they started to rebuild areas that had suffered from bushfires or floods, etc. So this stepping in and trying to overcome the immediate situation is something where adult education and learning organizations are really strong. And I mean by organizations both grassroots organizations as well as community education centers, etc. The problem is that this doesn't substantially lead to improvement. For fundamental improvement, like a real, sustainable economy, you need policymakers to shift the policies, and not only activists to, step out the fire or control the worst problems. Like in Ukraine, the immediate first aid training, or in South Africa, organizing soup kitchens and growing vegetables and to overcome the lockdown problems, etc.
Well, I think this invites all of the comments here is inviting us all to continued conversations, many more conversations with each other. And I think we're almost right on the hour. And I think I want to thank everyone who's here. But before we leave, I want to ask you, Anka, a comment. I think what you ended well with the hopeful new note on in terms of where things are. For me, one of the most hopeful notes is that there's an increased participation of women in ALE since 2018, and so that's very hopeful. But what are some of the things that you want to pull together for us to think about as we read that was not raised in this conversation, Anka, in terms of ALE, in terms of where we are going at this point in time? If you want to, bring a point or two that you want to leave us with as we end this webinar.
I find it difficult to sum up so many different approaches. Actually, what I benefit here from is a strong qualitative research, and qualitative research that ends up in either criticizing policies, like what Alisa and I did earlier, like what Amy and Alisa did together. And on the other hand, the international project was done for policymakers, for a non-profit organization that helps, that uses government funding, German government funding, in order to promote lifelong learning in the country, or to promote adult education and learning. They have 30 offices around the world. And what we gave them, like a picture of what they are doing, is something they really use for advocating for better law around adult education and learning, the implementation of better strategies, the implementation of funding, qualification schemes, train the trainer schemes, etc. So we do both, in some way we do research that happens within universities and often criticizes the practitioners or the policymakers, but we also do, and in this case we did, research that helps NGOs or networks to establish a better adult learning and education policy in the countries where they are doing this kind of advocacy work. And that's very I don't know, it feels really good when those who gave you the questions and say we need that research, when they finally say, oh, we can really use it, and you are invited to give presentations in Palestine, in Jordan, in North Africa, and digitally North Africa and everywhere. And this research has an impact for them. They feel understood, they feel encouraged, they feel they have scientific knowledge backing up their experiences, and they can negotiate on a better level. And that was quite a cool experience.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you, because we have also scholars here pursuing their doctorates and their higher education at Indiana University, elsewhere, as part of our attendees. And so this is an invitation for us all to pursue that research. Again, I want to thank you, Professor Grotlüschen, Professor Picker, Professor Belzer, and all our attendees at this webinar. This is a monthly event that is organized here in the School of Ed. And so thank you, everyone, for your interest and for your words of wisdom. Goodbye.